am Michelle Bottom, and today we will be having 3 special guests on our show. First up, Teresa Dinkelberg.
My name is Teresa Dinkelberg, and I'm going to be talking about the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. The 60s were a very fast point of activism for the rights and social norms of women. One of the crucial things was the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, made in 1967 by the federal government. This was made to investigate and report on conditions for women in Canada. Commissioners were to make recommendations for improving these conditions for women. The Commission traveled the country and in its report in 1970 documented a significant number of changes to be made. The Commission's 488-page report consisted of 167 recommendations covering all topics from family law, birth control, maternity leave, equal pay, rights for Aboriginal women, and much more. Over the next 20 years, most recommendations were followed by the government, at least partially. Many companies and agencies began to improve conditions as well. Over the following years, the National Action Committee took on the status of women and represented it in some 700 other activist groups. These groups helped write many laws and make changes for the rights of all individuals. These laws included laws against domestic violence, rights of minorities, and many children's rights. The Royal Commission on the Status of Women is a vital point in history because of its historical significance. Without this commission, many of the laws and regulations it helped form may not exist. This would cause today's women's oppression to be much worse. The Commission caused so many laws to pass that without it, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would be completely different. It could possibly leave out topics such as birth control, family law, and many more. I'm back. I'm going to be talking about women in the Charter. Canada in the early 20th century was affected greatly by its patriarchy government. Women were fighting for equality every day and were making great progress. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms was one of the things that helped greatly in their fight from oppression. Some examples could include women's right to vote, which provinces implemented from 1916 to 1940. The rights for benefits on maternity leave, which mostly only women took. The right to safe and knowledgeable abortion, because before 1969, it was illegal to even share knowledge about birth control. This was a greatly talked about issue because of people's point of view on it. One well-known Canadian pro-choice advocate was Dr. Henry Morgentaler. He was one of the few doctors that performed abortions before they were legal. He played a huge role in making abortions legal. He said, quote, "I want to make my contribution to humanity so that there will be no more Auschwitz. Children who are born, wanted, and are given love and attention will not build concentration camps." Many issues, such as the wage gap, have laws in the Charter that give people hope that eventually it could be resolved. But overall, though the Charter can prevent governments from passing laws that create inequalities, the Charter cannot require governments to pass laws that ensure equality. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is vital when looking at women's history in Canada because it is pretty much the main hub of equalities and inequalities. Women's oppression was greatly aided by the Charter because of this power it had and was also fought with it, thus making it extremely important when looking at Canada's history.
And now, introducing the girl with no name.
Hey, I have no name. When the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced in 1982, it allowed employers to set up affirmative action plans. These plans were a way to make sure employers hired a certain amount of women and minorities in an attempt to erase inequality in the workplace. Affirmative action plans have risen employment rates for minorities, but not everyone believes it is a good thing. Many argue that affirmative action is a breach on their rights because employers are hiring women and minorities for their identity and not their skills, therefore not true equality. This debate is still going on today, and it hasn't yet been agreed on whether or not affirmative action is actually a helpful program. Affirmative action in the Charter is an example of cause and consequence. The reason for affirmative action was an attempt to erase inequality in the workplace, and help women and minorities find jobs. The consequences were a decrease in unemployment for women and minorities, but many are hired just because they are minorities and not for their skills and qualifications. Some argue that affirmative action plans lead to women and minorities taking the place of more qualified candidates. Canadian people with disabilities have always faced immense struggles. Before the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced, governments often wouldn't make accommodations for people with disabilities because they claimed it was too expensive. But once the Charter was made in 1982, governments were required to improve accessibility. This made huge steps for people with disabilities, but they had to fight hard to make sure their rights were recognized and respected. Although accessibility is now required, the necessary accommodations are often ignored, and people with disabilities have to fight very hard, even today. For example, forced sterilization of women with mental disabilities wasn't outlawed until 1985. The Charter, including people with disabilities, was extremely historically significant and made huge steps forward. They now have rights to have their disabilities accommodated. The fight is far from over and consistently ongoing, but the Charter has made notable progress.
And now my twin, Bertha Shufflebottom. Hi, I'm Bertha Shufflebottom, and I'll be talking about Aboriginal activism in Canada. Before the 60s, Aboriginal people in Canada were not allowed to vote. Although they were granted the right to vote in 1960, they still were not treated equally due to the prejudiced mentality of many Canadians at that time. The quality of life for Aboriginal people was much lower than that of other Canadians. The Aboriginal people wanted to be treated as equals, so they started organizations, for example, the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations, to help them express how they were feeling to Canadian politicians. Even after the Aboriginal people tried to make their voices heard, not much changed for them. Discrimination towards Aboriginal and First Nations people is still prominent today. This is a big example of ethical dimension. It is evident that in the past, many Aboriginal people were discriminated against due to their race. Most Canadians today feel that this was wrong and that Aboriginals should have been treated equally, but this was not the case in the 60s. The main reason for the intolerant mentality of many Canadians in the past is because they most likely grew up surrounded by people, such as their parents, teachers, and friends, who taught them to think that way. Although more and more Canadians are standing up for the rights of Aboriginal people, they are still not fully treated as equals, which is why we must continue to stand up for the right of Aboriginals. And we'll also be talking about equality for women. Women in Canada have gone through many struggles for equal rights. For many years, women in Canada did not have the same rights as men, and they had to form women's rights organizations to make their voices heard. Many women's rights organizations in the early 20th century were very successful in attaining the rights that they deserve, such as the right to a proper education, the right to participating in the workforce, and the right to vote. As time went on, women's groups wanted to achieve full 100% gender equality in the 60s. These highly educated women began to form even more women's rights within ethnic communities and political parties, and have come a very long way with achieving equality since then. This is a great example of historical significance in Canada. The hard work that these Canadian women did for their rights has greatly impacted many women and is the reason why Canadian women are able to vote, have access to education, participate in the workforce, and have the same rights as men. Without the commitment and dedication of these women, we may not have had the rights that we do today. The end. Now, Bertha Applebottom.
I'm Bertha Applebottom, and I'll be talking about the white paper and the red paper. The red paper was established by Jean Chrétien, and he had been the Minister of Indian Affairs within the government. He had attempted to produce the white paper in an attempt to get equal rights for the Aboriginal people, but that would be stripping their rights to their lands and their titles as Aboriginal people away from them. He argues that this will benefit the Aboriginals. For the Indigenous people in Canada, this was just another attempt to disperse them as a nation and force them to assimilate into European Canadian society. He thinks it would make emphasis that this was an economic development and not cultural protection. This led to consequences that Pierre Trudeau's government did not intend. The Aboriginal people were shocked, to say the least. Harold Cardinal decided to voice their opinions through a novel he conducted, which people soon to begin to refer to as the Red Paper, previously known as the Unjust Society, fitting the situation quite well. The book had become a bestseller. This struck outrage within communities and the public, even some politicians, leading to the shelving of the white paper, giving the Indigenous their rights back to their land, while also giving them the rights to be equal to the Euro-Canadians. Both these topics are amazing examples of historical significance. Despite being related, the white paper and the red paper are one in their own. The white and red paper are contradicting statements by two different sides of a debate involving the First Nations rights. The white paper being something that was created by the Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, in an attempt to make it so the First Nations would have equal rights to other minority groups and pass the responsibilities of the First Nations over to each province. This would have created very long-lasting effects in which the Indian people would be stripped of their individuality as a nation of people, not to mention lose their right to their land, which was previously mentioned, and they originally owned before the European Canadians. This wasn't a new concept, it had only just been put into place at this time in 1969. The red paper had been the opposite of the white paper. The red paper was a book that was wrote by Harold Cardinal. It was a book to express the standpoints of the Aboriginal people. All this is relevant to the current day because the creation of the red paper had made it so that Aboriginal people had equal rights, but would still keep their titles and their lands, and it was most definitely rightfully theirs.